the Sunday before Easter is typically called Palm Sunday. It's a time to reflect on the beginning of Holy Week, the beginning of the week of all weeks in the life of Jesus on earth, that culminates with his death on the cross and his resurrection 3 days later. And again, at Easter, that is what we focus on there, is he died, but he rose again. And I cannot overstate this. Paul says it clearly in 1 Corinthians. But if the resurrection of Christ did not happen, if it were not true, you, with that one simple thing, if you could undo the resurrection of Christ, you have overthrown all of Christianity entirely. There would be no reason to be a Christian. So that's why we make such a big deal about it, because that is the point of why we're here. So today, let's focus on an event in Jesus' life that began, or it set off Holy Week, basically. It triggers a chain of events that lead to his death and then his resurrection. In Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, is sometimes in English Bibles, it'll have a label. It will say the triumphant or triumphal entry. And in fact, this passage, or this story of Jesus here, it's recorded in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's not always the case. So my opinion is, when you find a story in the life of Jesus that all four Gospels record down, then it is worthy of very much paying more attention to. It's very important. Well, this one we're going to look at is recorded by all four of them. It is really a coronation. If you've ever heard of a coronation, it is where a king or a queen, or rather the person is about to become king or queen. And so they'll have this big event called a coronation. It's all kinds of pomp and fanfare and rolling out the red carpet, and they do all these things to welcome in the new king or queen. And it will culminate with them being crowned, and then they declare their leadership, that their allegiance in there to lead the people and guide them wisely and faithfully and all those things. So we, though, in America are not used to those. In fact, our founding fathers did not like coronations. Hence, they said we will never do them. We do not have kings and queens in America. But I just want to point out that most human societies throughout history have been ruled by kings or queens to one degree or another. So a lot of people are used to coronations. The Jews were used to coronations. The Roman Empire was used to appointing someone to be Caesar. So here in this event of Jesus, I want to draw your attention to that idea of a coronation. It is as if Jesus is being given a kingly coronation. He is going through an event where he will be crowned king, essentially. But his kingly coronation is unlike any other king or queen's coronation. And I'll share that with you as we go. Because imagine this. This is a hypothetical, but it's also not far off from what happened to Jesus. Pretend that there is a person, this man, and he's next in line to be king of pretend country A, we'll call it. And they start off on Sunday or Monday, and they begin all these week-long events to honor this new man who's about to become king. And the people, the population, are just shouting out with cheers how much they love this person, and they're excited for him to be crowned king. And they're declaring their allegiance and their oath to this man to be their king. And everything is wonderful. Then pretend, though, that by the end of the week, all of a sudden, for some strange reason, that very same country that was begging for him to be their king are crying out that he be killed. They don't want him any longer. They want to put him away. It would be very strange. It would be a very curious thing. Like, why would you go from earlier in the week, you were begging for this man to be your king. Later in the week, you are begging for him to be killed. What happened? I want to suggest to you that the little hypothetical I gave, that's actually not far off from what I'm going to show you this morning of what happened to Jesus. Jesus has a kingly coronation, and it starts on Palm Sunday. But what is so tragic about they are saying, we love you, Jesus, be our king. But by the end of the week, you know where the story goes, they're crying out for his death. They don't want him anymore. The question is, well, what happened? Why? How did they go from A all the way to Z in 1 week? What hoops did they jump through to get there mentally? I want to say this, and it's the title of the message. Think of this as Jesus had a misunderstood. The key word is misunderstood. He had a misunderstood kingly coronation. Jesus was very woefully misunderstood by the people that were declaring him to be their king. And here's how I want you to think of this for us. Next Sunday is Easter, and I do want it to be a joyful occasion. And I am so grateful that for whatever reason, people choose Sunday usually, or Easter Sunday. Churches are usually filled with people that maybe honestly, the rest of the year, they never show up to church. And we welcome these visitors. We welcome people. We want people there. I love for people to be in the house of God and hear His Word. I was thinking about that concept, though, and this message, and I thought, I wonder, most unfortunately, how many of these people will show up on an Easter Sunday who never show up any other time of the year, and for whatever reason, though, they are missing the point of Jesus. How many people will show up to churches next Sunday, and they're there for whatever reason, but they don't actually get Jesus? They misunderstand Him. They don't really see Him for who He is. That is exactly what's going to happen to him here in this passage, is Jesus will very much be misunderstood, and it culminates with His death and then His resurrection. Let me set the scene for this passage that starts in 21 verse 1. This is called Passover week. It is leading up to the Passover event for the Jews. That's like their Christmas holiday. That's everything for them. The entire Jewish calendar revolved around Passover. Jesus is a faithful Jewish man. He is on His way to Jerusalem to keep the Passover. In fact, in a moment when we're done with the message, we'll do the Lord's Supper. It was at the Passover meal where He instituted the Lord's Supper. He reinterpreted it basically, gave it new meaning through Him. So He's on His way to Jerusalem, and where we'll pick up is He is now entering Jerusalem to fulfill the Passover feast. There are countless Jews that have traveled to Jerusalem just for this event. Massive national holiday for the Jews. I read some scholars that took a Jewish historian named Josephus. He wrote just a few years after Jesus was on this earth, maybe 10 or so. So he's very recent to when Jesus would have been on earth. They found records of this Jewish historian Josephus saying that it was not uncommon during Passover week for 260,000 lambs to be slaughtered for Passover. One lamb could serve up to 10 people. Now, if you take 260,000 times 10, and we're not saying that that's literally how many people they were, but the point is there was a lot of people. A lot of people that had traveled into Jerusalem to be here for this event. Some say as many as upwards of 2 million visitors in Jerusalem. So when I read to you and you see these words, the crowds and all, we're talking massive sea of people that would have been around Jesus when all this is going on. And when we read this here, I want us to look at what can we learn at some of these events that happened in Jesus' misunderstood coronation. Let me start in the first few verses here, and I want to begin with this point. What I want you to see is Jesus is always in control. Let me explain that, and I think this is very important. In the first 5 verses is where I'm getting this. This week of Jesus' life will have many, many crazy events. He will be falsely accused. He will have a phony trial in a kangaroo court. You know the story. It ends with Him being nailed to a cross. He's killed. Several things will happen this week that as an outsider, it would appear as though that Jesus' life, it's just crazy. It would appear as though that Jesus maybe had a plan of going to Jerusalem and doing one thing, but when He got there, things went terribly wrong, and the whole week is crazy. And so it can look to an outsider as if Jesus is just a victim of all these events and these circumstances. But I want to make this point to you this morning. The week of Jesus' life here may seem out of control, but in fact, Jesus is in control the entire time. The entire time of everything that happens to Jesus, as bad as it looks, nothing is happening to Him that is accidental, random, or just dumb luck. It's all part of a plan. His death at the end of this week was all part of the plan for why He went to Jerusalem in the first place. And what actually happens that I'll show you when Jesus enters Jerusalem, He purposely takes certain actions that trigger a chain of events that almost guarantee He will be crucified by the end of the week. Jesus went to Jerusalem for the purposes of being crucified. So nothing here is out of control. Here's a couple of ways we see that. The first is we see that there were what I'll call pre-arranged resources. Look at verses 1 through 3. When they had approached Jerusalem and had come to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus then sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied there and a colt with it. Now notice that. He's telling his disciples, sends two of them, don't know which two it is, but he sends them to a particular village, and he says, go to a particular place where there's a particular donkey there. Notice how Jesus already knows where they need to go and where they're going to find this donkey. This isn't just some random donkey. This isn't some random house. This is all pre-arranged. It's been pre-set up. We're not sure how, to be honest. Either he somehow in the past, it's not recorded, and maybe knew this family, the owner of these donkeys, and had arranged this out ahead of time. Maybe just through his divine wisdom, he knows which house to go to, and maybe the Holy Spirit on the other end had communicated to the donkey owners that this is going to happen. We're not sure, but here's the point, no matter which way you want to take it. This was a pre-arranged set of resources. Jesus is in control of this situation. In verse 3, it says, if anyone says anything to you, you shall say the Lord needs them, and he will send them on immediately. Mark and Luke actually add a detail that it will be a donkey and her young colt with her. They're going to bring the two together. And the young colt has never been ridden by a person before, is the one that he's after here. But again, these are pre-arranged resources, proving to me Jesus is in control of this entire situation. Another thing that we see is there's pre-arranged fulfillment of prophecy. Look at verse 4 now. Now this took place so that what was spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled. And Matthew quotes the prophecy in verse 5. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So here again, Jesus is in control because he is setting things up strategically so that he will fulfill an Old Testament prophecy. Matthew always draws attention to this. Every time Jesus fulfills an Old Testament prophecy, he makes it very clear. But Jesus is strategically setting these things in motion. Again, nothing's random this week. Nothing is random that leads to his death. The prophecy is this. It's found in Zechariah chapter 9. I will read just a snippet of it, verses 8 through 10. God prophesied to Israel that even though they had foreign armies invading them and people pushing in on them and disparaging them and dispossessing them, God said through the mouth of the prophet Zechariah that he would eventually one day be like a type of fortress wall around them, and he would protect them from all their enemies. And here's more of it in Zechariah 9, 8 through 10. This is God talking, I will camp around my house, talking about Israel, because of an army, because of him who passes by and returns. And no oppressor will pass over them anymore. For now I have seen with my eyes. Now notice verse 9. Here's what Jesus fulfilled. Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Daughter of Zion is just a figure of speech for the inhabitants of Israel. So he's saying, listen, you Jews, shout in triumph, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So not just any donkey, it's a colt. And then in verse 10, I will eliminate the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be eliminated, and he will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. So the Jews knew this prophecy for hundreds of years by the time Jesus showed up on earth. And the Jews were waiting for a person to come that would fulfill this. And what they expected was, based on how they read Zechariah, that this person would come and he would be a king figure for them. He would bring peace and security to the Jews. Then it says he was riding in on a donkey. Well, the best I could find on why that's significant is it seems to be symbolic that when a king rode on a donkey, it was implying that it's a time of peace, not war. If a king and his people were at war, then the king's riding in on a war horse with a chariot. But if they're at a time of peace, they use the donkey. Donkey's not a beast of war. It's something else, but war horses are. So the idea the Jews developed was, well, when this king arrives, he'll bring peace. But here's the thing. Here's the thing, though. They had sort of misunderstood this. They believed that when this king showed up, he would bring peace through conquering all their enemies. He would put down through force all the bad guys. And that's how he would impose peace. It would be, as the saying goes, peace through strength. He would just be stronger than everybody else, so no one would bother Israel anymore, and that's how he would bring peace. That is not technically what Zechariah was saying. The prophecy was saying that when this king comes, it just simply said he brings peace on a donkey, not a horse of war, on a donkey bringing peace, and he brings security to God's people. Matthew directly says, hey, guess what? Jesus fulfilled that prophecy. He is in control of the situation this week. He showed Israel that he comes as their promised Messiah, not to bring war, but to bring salvation and peace. And what they misunderstood was they were thinking purely earthly. They thought, well, when the king comes that God sends, he'll overthrow Rome, because they hated being under Roman occupation. They said he'll overthrow Rome and we'll be independent as a nation again and all will be well. We'll have peace like in the times of David and then Solomon. He'll restore Israel to their former glory. Well, Matthew draws attention here that, however, though, when Jesus shows up, he didn't come to overthrow Rome. He came, if anything, to overthrow the Jewish religious leaders of his day. As you keep reading after verse 11, you'll see the next scene is when he goes in the temple with the whips and he starts driving out the money changers and overthrowing tables. That event for sure put Jesus on the path to being crucified. Because what he did is he directly told the Jewish leaders, you guys are the bad guys. Not Rome, it's you. Well, that ticked everybody off. He came to bring peace by restoring God's people spiritually back to God, so they could be with him again and not in conflict with him. But that's what they misunderstood about him. And make no mistake about it, the book of Revelation says Jesus will return again on a white horse with the armies of heaven for war. But during the first time he came, Matthew says, he came not to wage war. He came to show people as the king, he's a king of peace, bringing this type of peace and salvation. Israel's king would come to them, but he's riding on a donkey, not a war horse. This Holy Week, I want to say again, it will look out of control to an outsider. Some would say, well, Jesus made mistakes here or else he wouldn't have been killed. But that is not true at all. This is a predetermined plan that Jesus is working out all according to plan. The way he even enters Jerusalem on that donkey sets into motion a chain of events, knowing full well it leads with his death later that week. Why? Because he has to do these things to offer us salvation from our sins. Look at Mark 9:30, I'll read to you. And from there they went on and began to go through Galilee. And Jesus did not want anyone to know about it, because he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Verse 32, but they, that's his disciples, did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. I read this because as far back earlier in Jesus' earthly ministry, he has been telling his disciples, this is going to happen. You need to prepare yourself. They loved Jesus, and even they misunderstood at first. They thought he's come to be the powerful king to overthrow Rome. And he kept saying to them, guys, we're eventually working our way to Jerusalem. And when I get to Jerusalem, I'll be delivered over in a phony trial, but it's going to happen, and they'll kill me. But I'll rise again 3 days later. He kept trying to teach them and prepare them of this has to happen for sin to be forgiven. But here they don't even understand. In Acts chapter 4, verse 27, after Jesus rose again from the dead and ascended back to the Father, the early church was facing some persecution. They were being threatened with jail time and beaten and told, stop preaching in the name of Jesus. Well, after one instance when a couple of the disciples were released from prison, they go back to the rest of the church and they all pray that God would give them boldness to face the opposition and keep preaching the name of Jesus. I want to read a snippet of what they prayed to God. In Acts 4:27, truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel. Notice verse 28. To do whatever your hand and purpose predestined to occur. Acts makes it painfully clear that everything that happened to Jesus was according to plan. Jesus being born at the exact time in history that he was born, in the exact geographical location that he was born, him entering Jerusalem in the very specific manner that he enters it on that colt, doing the things he does, saying the things he says, the apostles could look back and say here in Acts, this was all according to God's plan. Jesus was in control the entire time. I would say this for us today. If things in your life seem out of control, you must trust as a Christian they are never out of control. God is never caught off guard. I know that's easier said than done, but it is the truth. Our lives could seem like chaos and nothing's going right and we're in a turmoil and we don't understand what's happening. You have to trust that God is not caught off guard by anything that's happening in your life. God never lets you slip through the cracks. You're never sort of put on the back burner and forgotten. The events here, just in these first 5 verses, I want to stress again, show and prove Jesus was always in control, and He is still in control of the events in your life today as well. Jesus' Holy Week was all according to plan. A plan to fulfill our salvation and save us. It took Jesus going through all that chaos, though, to get things put back in order. The chaos of your life, I would say, has a purpose. I don't know what it is, and in fact, you may not know what it is. But you have to trust that whatever's going on, there's a purpose. There's a plan behind it. God is not letting random things come into your life and just enjoys watching your life be toyed with. That's not how He operates. It's always according to a plan, even if we don't see it yet. Then the next thing to see from Jesus' misunderstood coronation, He's in control and He now enters Jerusalem, or He will in just a minute, on this colt. Here's what I want you to see next. He is temporarily declared king. The key word's temporarily. He's temporarily declared king. Look at verse 6. The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and laid their cloaks on them, and He sat on the cloaks. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them on the road. Now the crowds going ahead of Him and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" Now here you see in a particular curious event to me. Jesus sits on the colt and He's going along the way. And as He goes along the way, there was already a massive crowd that followed Jesus into Jerusalem. So we believe this is the crowd in particular that are cutting the branches and throwing their cloaks on the ground, and they're the ones crying out this stuff. So they had followed Jesus from Galilee. They've seen His ministry. They've seen Him heal blind people and people with leprosy and multiply food. So they're like fans following Jesus. And they're following Him here in the town, and they're crying out all these things. John 12 through 13 adds a detail. On the next day, when the large crowd had come to the feast, heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, they took branches of the palm trees. That's why we call it Palm Sunday. They specifically took palm tree branches. They went out to meet Him and began shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is He who comes in the name of the Lord." So you have this sort of red carpet event that they throw Jesus. He's on His way in, and people are taking their outer tunic off, putting it on the road, because they're basically saying, "Jesus, we so respect you. You're not worthy for the donkey that you're on. Its bare feet to touch the road. So we want to cover it with our coats and the palm tree branches." So they're paying a lot of respect to Jesus here. They're crying out something interesting as well. They're saying Hosanna. This is a Hebrew Aramaic word that means something like they're crying out to Him to save them. It's almost like a begging plea to someone. When you would say to them, "I beg you, please save me." That's in a sense what they're saying to Jesus. But it was meant to be a title of praise and honoring someone. So they're saying to Jesus, "We believe in you, Jesus, that you have the power to save us. So we beg you, please save us." So they're crying out to Him, Hosanna. And then they say another phrase, the Son of David, they call Him. This is a very common title for the Messiah. The Son of David was a title that the Jews held on to. They knew that when the Messiah come, He would come from the lineage of David. He would have the rights to sit on David's throne. So they said, well, the Messiah will be the Son of David and rule on the throne that David once had and restore Israel to her glory. Then they say this other phrase, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." This is actually a quote from Psalm 118. In Psalm 118, verse 25, it says, "Please, O Lord, do save us." So this is Israel crying out to God to save them. "Please, O Lord, do send prosperity." Notice verse 26 is where we believe they were pulling this from. "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you from the house of the Lord." So the crowds were declaring Jesus as their expected king. They're saying this to Him like, "Jesus, you're it. You're the guy. You're the Son of David. You're the King of prosperity that's come. You're the one that can save us." But I want to say this very clearly. They wanted Jesus to fit their expectations of who they thought the Messiah should be. That's the key. That's what throws everything off at the end of this week. They're saying this to Jesus with their mouth, but in their hearts, they have a particular idea or a concept of what Jesus should do. So later in the week, when he doesn't do it, he fails to meet their expectations. And that's what ends up with them simply casting him away. They thought Jesus would bring peace through overthrowing Rome, as I said, bring literal prosperity, defeat all their enemies. Rather, though, Jesus said he does come to bring peace, but spiritual peace first. He comes to bring people peace with God once again. He comes to bring forgiveness of sins. The crowd's declaration of Jesus as king would not last long. You know what happens by Friday. The crowds are calling for him to be killed. So that's why I say they temporarily declared him to be their king. They very much were calling him king, yes, but that ended quickly by the end of the week. That leads me to say, I think because Jesus is a misunderstood king. He's very much misunderstood by these people. The last two verses say in verse 10, "When he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, 'Who is this?' And the crowds were saying, 'This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee.'" Here again you see that as he now makes his way into deeper parts of Jerusalem and the massive sea of people with him crying out, "Hosanna, Son of David," and all those things. Well, the wording here is it caused a borderline panic for the rest of the people in Jerusalem. They're seeing this and they're like, what is going on? Why are there all these people crying out about this guy Jesus? What is happening right now? So the city's in confusion. Notice what some said in response. So the wording in the Greek, it's as if the crowd following Jesus had started to intersperse with the other crowd that didn't understand what's going on. So it's like you're standing there and you're watching this happen. Like there's this guy on a donkey passing before you. Everybody's crying out about him. And you're just saying out loud, well, who is this guy? And then someone next to you that knows, oh, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee. He's come now into town. Well, here's what I want to draw your attention to. Whenever I read the Bible, I like to ask, what did it not say? You can find out a lot of information by asking what it didn't say. Because sometimes it's intentional to say what it said specifically. So here's what they did not say. They did not say, this is Jesus, the Son of God. This is Jesus, the Word of God that became flesh. This is Jesus, God Himself that has come down to mankind to save us. No, they said Jesus, what title did they give Him? The prophet. Now, that's an honorary title for sure. But being a prophet is not really who He was, is it? He was something so much more than a prophet. That's why I say they misunderstood Him. They missed who He really was. In Matthew 16, verse 13, Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. He was asking His disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? He was basically asking His apostles, who do people say I am? They said, well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, that's a prophet, others Jeremiah, another prophet, and others say a different prophet. So this is not new. Everybody that loved Jesus really loved Him, but they loved Him for what He could do. He could just make food appear and raise dead people, and they're like, this is awesome. He should be our leader because He's just really powerful. So they thought He was a super powerful prophet, a messenger from God. They did not declare what Peter says here. Verse 15, Jesus asked them directly, who do you say that I am? Verse 16, Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So they missed that, is my point. The crowds loved Him, but they loved Him for the wrong reasons. They appreciated Him, but they appreciated Him for selfish reasons. They only liked Jesus for what they thought they could get out of Him. They only thought He should be their king because they thought He could help the nation of Israel. They missed what Peter said here. They did not get and grasp that He wasn't just a prophet. He was the Son of God. God who had come down to save people from their sins. Jesus' coronation was unique for sure. Jesus showed He's always in control though. So whenever you talk about stuff this Holy Week and all the events that happened and the cross, none of that is an accident. Jesus was declared king temporarily by the crowds, but later that week, they don't want Him king anymore. He's misunderstood. Jesus' coronation did not end with a crown of gold and jewelry, did it? It ended with a crown of thorns, we would say. His coronation did not end with Him sitting on a throne, did it? No, it ended with him nailed to a cross of wood. Jesus was declared king by crowds early in the week that later in the week they don't accept him anymore. I would say this is the idea, the main problem. Those crowds wanted Jesus on their terms. They refused to come to Jesus on his terms. That is my worry, like I said, for many people today. They miss Jesus. They think they're good with Jesus. They might even pay respect to Jesus. But they miss him for who he really is. And my charge would be, don't miss Jesus for who he really is. Have you received Jesus on his terms? Or made him something that you personally want him to be and only received him on your terms? Have you confessed Jesus as God, as Lord, as King and Master? Or something less like the crowds did? Don't just pay lip service to Jesus. Commit your entire life to Jesus. Jesus really is a triumphant king. That's what's ironic. The crowd was right, actually, but they just didn't know why they were right. They were right because he really is the King of Kings who comes to bring peace, but they just misunderstood how he was going about this. I want to say this to us Christians: rejoice that he is the King of peace, and he's brought salvation and peace between us and God. That's why he ultimately came. I'm going to now transition us to our time of Lord's Supper. And I'd like you to think of this time as the Lord's Supper as we honor Jesus as our King, but we honor what he had to go through in order to save us and to bring us peace between us and God.